Some of my photos look like very straight ahead photos, and others really skew things outside everywhere. Is a whole infinite amount of reality. There's an emotional reality too, and the emotional reality is important to me. What I try to do is I try to look for the little moments that I think are overlooked and shouldn't be for one reason or another. And when that really started to click for me was when I was photographing mill buildings that were getting torn down. The demolition of the mill buildings was my first real body of work. It's the first body of work that began to grip me and really start to have a life of its own. I started to appreciate the mills when I was living in one and working in one. And I started to appreciate what the building materials they were made of. I started to appreciate the brickwork and the masonry for a very utilitarian kind of a place that had a lot of grace and beauty to it. And then I started thinking about the social history. The idea of industry, the Industrial Revolution was literally right here first. Generation after generation of people sustained themselves and spent their lives in these buildings, and that had a real cultural value. These places were abandoned, neglected, falling in on themselves. You know, there was a tragedy in that. I think my photos simply recorded that these buildings were here. I think that's what I felt that I could do about all of the demolition. I also tried to show that there was a fragility to things in the human world that we think are going to last forever when they seem strong and vibrant, and don't last forever and simply disappear. And I really started to play with the focus with the camera that I was using to highlight an emotional feeling about these huge, solid, well-built buildings being demolished and becoming very fragile. It was a process that unfolded over years. When I was starting out, I wouldn't have said those were my aims, but as I started to make pictures that I liked, I started to better articulate the reasons that I liked them over time. The way I have been working for a long time now, probably 15 years, is with a big, heavy 4x5 studio view camera, which is even heavier than a field camera. And I've gravitated to it for two reasons. The first reason was, before I started using this camera, I was shooting 35mm and I was doing a lot of street photography. And I just started to lose my connection with my subject. I started to lose interest, and that was really scaring me. So using this big camera that was very physical forced me to slow down, and it forced me to actually see more than I had been. And then when I started to realize the possibilities of having images with sharp focus and soft focus in the same frame and manipulating it in a way that was, had nothing to do with reality, that became very exciting to me. I also have an interest in three-dimensional work. Every idea that I've ever had that's been three-dimensional has eventually found itself best as a photograph. Walking along the shore of the Narragansett Bay, I started to see that the Tideline had a lot of organic material and a lot of plastics and trash that we threw into the environment somehow. And the more I looked at it, the more interesting I thought it was. All the wind and the rain and the tides bring everything together. You're going to find a concentrated sample of what is actually in our environment. And it has a rhythm of its own, and it has a placement of its own. I started trying to photograph it, and it ended up just looking like trash. I couldn't make them tell that story. So then I decided the best thing to do was to try to actually bring this tide line into the gallery. I did some research and I found some marine grade epoxy, and then I would brush that onto the flotsam, jetsam trash, and it made it one solid mass. So I started to think of these things as kind of sculptural snapshots. When you put it on the wall, was all of a sudden you could look at it and then reflect on it. It now had the feeling of being an object to be seen and decoded, and I think then your questions could start to arise. And you could start to realize that is what our environment really is now. I had the chance to do a residency in North Adams, Massachusetts. And I was born in North Adams when this company called Sprague Electric was employing most of the town. My father worked for Sprague Electric and moved when I was a baby and I'd never been back. And of course, in North Adams, Mass is one of the world's largest museums dedicated to contemporary art called Mass MoCA. And I knew that there would be a real interesting divide between people that had been living in North Adams for generations, who were been initially drawn there as factory workers, and Mass MoCA, which was catering to people who enjoy modern art and are typically coming from out of state or from farther away to partake of this. I feel very comfortable in both worlds, and so I felt that it would be interesting to go back. The body of work is called Born Without Memories, and it's the idea that if I had grown up here, what would it have been like? Mass MoCA came in, took so much of the space that Sprague Electric had been using, and I can't imagine it anything but help that town economically. However, there just simply aren't the number of jobs that had been there. So there's a lot of people living there without a lot of opportunity. And I think there was just a real sense in that town that they'd been completely abandoned and left behind by the world that had just moved on. I'm actually not a big believer in fate at all, but I really do believe that there's so much in life that is out of our control, and that, if things are going great, you got to appreciate that, because things don't have to go great. And so much of your life depends on where you're born. A few years later, my son was born, and I was walking him around constantly. And when I was doing that, that gave me the quiet, thoughtful time to look at my neighborhood in a different way. It allowed me to start seeing photographs. It allowed me to start seeing places that had little historic bits of interest. And it also made me think that I wanted to show him the neighborhood he was born in. I do almost nothing that's exotic. I don't climb a mountain. I don't go to a foreign place. It's absolutely pedestrian. I've always been a very big believer that the extraordinary is in the common, and that deep and significant interest is around you. It's around you literally. I don't know what this next body of work is going to completely feel like. I do want to show what it's like to be here, now, at this point in time. I want that to last in these instants. And I want to say, this is what it was like to walk down the street. This is what it was like to meet this person. I want those things to be portrayed. I am excited because I think that the experiences I've had over the last few years gives me more of a clarity than I think I had in the past about the actual creation of work, and then what happens when the work is done. I used to have a lot more question marks about both of those processes. I feel confident in the way things build now. Now it goes the way it needs to go. And I think now I have fewer question marks, and that's nice.